This is Living Power with Dan Hurst.
I don't remember the preacher's name, but he always ended his half hour with the statement, "You don't have any problems, all you need is God." And I would think, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. And I still think it's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Because first of all, if you don't have any problems, you don't need God. But most importantly, you do have problems. And if you're a Christian, you really do have problems. Have you noticed that? In fact, that's one of the things that the psalmist talks about when he, through all of the Psalms, you read the Psalms, he says, why is it that the wicked prosper? They don't seem to have any real problems. And here I am trying to be faithful to you, and I got problems. Well, it doesn't really work that way. It's just a matter of perception. But the fact of the matter is, God's promises don't make life easier. Sometimes they make it harder. Sometimes God's promises hurt. John 16:33 says, I have told you, this is Jesus speaking, this is toward the end of his life, toward the end of his, certainly at the end of his ministry there, and he says, I have told you these things so that in me you may have peace. In this world you will have trouble. But take heart. I've overcome the world. The King James says, be of good cheer. I have overcome the world. Now, there are two promises in that verse from Jesus. Two promises. The first one is that in this world you will have trouble. There's a promise. Don't you love that promise? Here's the other promise. The world doesn't win. It's a promise from God. You can take heart in that. Life is going to be difficult. There are going to be those times in our lives where we just cannot deal with some of the things that come our way. And there are some things that we can deal with, but we are devastated, or we are hurt, or we are lonely, or we're broken. And God says, you will have trouble, but I want you to know something. The world doesn't win. Sometimes God's promises require a cost. Sometimes God's promises cost us. They require commitment and even turning our back on some things that mean something to us. But God's promises are worth far more than it costs us. I remember as a boy growing up on the mission field, one Christmas, a number of missionaries had gathered together at our house for a little Christmas celebration. We did that every Christmas. All of the missionaries would get together, even sometimes North Americans who weren't missionaries. They just a place for the people from the U.S. to kind of get together and hang together at Christmas. And late in the evening, as everybody was sitting around in the living room, the conversation turned to memories of home. It always did that. And it was always fun to sit there because as a boy, I didn't really know anything about the United States. And so it was interesting to hear them talk about home. And I'll never forget the words of one of the missionaries who said very quietly one night in the lull of the conversation, he said, I miss home terribly, but if I went back, I would miss my calling even worse. You see, we are not promised easy lives. We are not promised that life is going to be happy. In fact, we are promised that sometimes we are going to have to face those difficulties. But the other promise, the balance of that promise is that the world doesn't win. And here's an extension to that promise. God does. And what's happening in our lives now is a preparation for what God is going to do in us and through us for eternity. This little speck on the wall, if you take this wall and call it eternity, this little speck right here is what's happening in our world right now. It's a little speck. But in the context of time, in the context of eternity, it's a very small time that we spend here on earth. And what happens on this little speck is preparing us for all of eternity. God's promises are not going to be easy, but they are eternal. And God is up to something eternally good. Which brings us to the second point, and that is that we are God's people in a foreign land. That's what Abraham said. He said, I'm an alien and a stranger among you. Sell me some property for a burial site so I can bury my dead. Abraham understood that he was not going to see the complete fulfillment of God's promise. God's promise says that you're going to be the father of many nations. Abraham knew he wasn't going to see nations grow up in that area that were his children. He knew that. He had actually 2 children. And right now he was just concentrating on one. He knew he wasn't going to see the fulfillment of God's promise. He just knew that he was part of it. He knew that God was up to something that extended beyond him. Well, the fact of the matter is, God's up to something in your life that extends beyond you. And part of that means that you are on duty. And God has moved you to a foreign land, if you will, to take up residence to accomplish His will and His purpose. Hebrews 11 puts it this way. Hebrews 11, starting with verse 8. By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place that he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he didn't know where he was going. By faith, he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. Abraham knew that he was part of something eternal. What was happening there during his life was not about him. It was about eternity. The same thing is true in your life. What's happening in your life now is part of eternity. It's not about you. It's about what God wants to do through you, preparing the world